Ladies and gentlemen, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the first video of the day. In today's video, we are going to be predicting the Big Ten records. We're going to talk conference championship. We're going to break down every team's schedule and give their record predictions for the Big Ten Conference. But first, of course, if you guys are new to the channel, obviously you know what to do. Be sure to like, subscribe, turn that bell on. We do our best to post on this channel every single day. I think for the past couple of days, we've done at least 2 videos a day. All college football so far this week, though, as we are ramping up for the season to start on Saturday. We are 2 days away until college football makes its return, the greatest sport in history to on this face of the planet. We are almost there, fellas. It is just around the corner, but we still have to talk about the Big Ten Conference and give our record predictions for that as well. In the second video of today, of course, you guys are going to be getting SEC predictions. And then in the last and final video, which should come out around 6:30, 7 o'clock here on the channel for those of you keeping tabs, it is going to be, that is going to be my college football playoff national champion predictions and my Heisman Trophy finalist as well. So, if you're into predictions, we're wrapping up Predictions Week here tomorrow. You guys are going to get 2 videos. We're going to have our first Madden rebuild on the channel with the Titans. And then secondly, you guys are going to be getting Week 0 predictions, breaking down each game. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and hop right in to this Big Ten Conference record predictions. Alright, so you guys have seen how we've done this so far. Throughout the week, we've just been going team by team, basically in one form, and talking about that. So let's go ahead and get started. These videos do tend to typically take longer, so strap in, get some popcorn as we talk college football. Starting with Illinois, the Illinois Fighting Illini. What are they going to be in 2024? Well, for starters, you win your first game against Eastern Illinois. You lose to Kansas. You beat Central Michigan. You lose to Nebraska on the road. I'm very high on Dylan Raiola, and we will talk about him in a second, so stay tuned for that one. But you go on the road to Drew Allar and Penn State, and you lose that game. You come home and play Purdue. I think you lose that game. You play Michigan at home. That's pretty much a guaranteed loss right there. At Oregon, that's going to be a loss. Versus Minnesota, that's going to be a win. Versus Michigan State, that's going to be a loss. At Rutgers, you get a win there. And then at Northwestern, you get a win there for a final record, I believe, of 4-8 along the lines. Now, this Big Ten schedule for Illinois is not very favorable. Obviously, you got to go to Kansas, number 1, in the pre-Big Ten season. Then, you got to face Nebraska on the road as your first Big Ten opponent in conference play. Next, you go to Penn State. Oregon, you also play them on the road. You host Michigan during those as well. There are some tough games for Illinois, and I do not think that they are going to be bowl eligible. Now, moving on is Indiana, the Indiana Hoosiers. For starters, you get a win against FIU there at home. You then get a win against Western Illinois at home, and then you get a win at UCLA. I think that you win that game. And then you wrap up your pre-Big Ten start versus Charlotte with a W as well. Then you go on to lose every single game that there is. That schedule right there is really tough. You play Maryland at home. I think that's the only Big Ten Conference game I see them winning. Then you host Nebraska, which is going to be a loss. At Washington, it's going to be a loss. At Michigan State, it's going to be a loss. Versus Michigan, that's going to be a loss. And then at Ohio State with a loss. And then at Purdue, versus Purdue with a loss as well. So, not looking good for the Indiana Hoosiers this year. It is what it is. Moving on is the Iowa Hawkeyes. Well, for starters, you play Illinois State at home. I think that's a W. Then you play Iowa State at home. That's also going to be a W right there. Versus Troy, that's a W. At Minnesota, that is a loss. At Ohio State, that's a loss. At home versus Washington, that's going to be a loss right there. At Michigan State, that's going to be a win in my book. Versus Northwestern, that's going to be a win. At Wisconsin, that's going to be a win. At UCLA, that'll be a win. At Maryland, that'll be a win. And then versus Nebraska, I think you take the cake there against Dylan Raiola, which turns out to be a pretty dang good schedule for me. only having a couple of losses in there. I think 9-3 for them is a really good record, especially defensive-wise or offensive-wise. But that is the Iowa Hawkeyes. Moving on to the Maryland Terrapins. What are they going to be in this conference in 2024? Well, for starters, you open the season at home versus UConn with a massive W right there. Versus Michigan State, you get a win there in a close game, might I add. At Virginia, you win. Versus Villanova, you win. At Indiana, you take the win. Versus Northwestern, you take the L. Versus USC, you lose. Versus Minnesota, at Minnesota, you get the win right there. At Oregon, you get the loss. Versus Rutgers, that is a win right there. Versus Iowa, that's a loss. And then at Penn State, that is a loss as well. I believe a somewhat manageable schedule. 6-6 shouldn't be out of the question for Maryland right there. Moving on, though, is the Michigan Wolverines, the defending national champions. And what are they going to be with 2024? Well, for starters, you lose your head coach Jim Harbaugh to the NFL. You lose J.J. McCarthy to the NFL. And then you lose like 16 different players in the NFL. They are 182nd percentile, I believe, in returning production. That is a big number. They are like 128th out of 134 FBS teams in returning production. What that necessarily means is that they do not have a lot of guys coming back, but it is still a very manageable schedule. So let's go ahead and break it all down. Versus Fresno State, you start out week 1 with a win right there. Versus Texas, I think you take the L to Quentin Ewers and that team on there. It's going to be an early type of battle. I think Texas is going to come out, start out hot, and win this game as well. Versus Arkansas State, you get a win there. Versus USC, you get the win right there. Versus Minnesota, you get a win. At Washington in a national championship rematch, you get a win. At Illinois, that's going to be a win right there. Versus Michigan State, that's going to be a win as well. Versus Oregon, that's a win. At Indiana, that is going to be a W right there. Versus Northwestern is a win. And then at the Ohio State Buckeyes with a loss. To finish the year, I believe, 10-2. Not a bad bounce back year after winning the national championship, if I do say so myself. Now, moving on is the Michigan State Spartans. What are they going to look like in this upcoming season in college football? Well, for starters, you get a win at home versus Florida Atlantic. I think that's a given. Then you take on Maryland on the road. That's going to be a loss right there. Versus Prairie View, that's a win right there. At Boston College, that is going to be a W. Versus Ohio State, at home, that is going to be a loss right there. At Oregon, you take the L there. Versus Indiana, that's a win. At Illinois, that's a win. Versus Purdue, that's a win. And then versus Rutgers as well with a W. So this schedule for Michigan State turns out to be fairly easy. The only two tough opponents you have are Ohio State and Oregon. No Penn State this year. No Michigan this year. That's going to be a fun one to watch as well. So, actually, I take that back. They do play Michigan, but we will talk about that one later in time. Now, moving on is the Minnesota Golden Gophers, a team that I really don't know what is going to be like in 2024. For starters, you host the North Carolina Tar Heels, and I think you lose that game. Then you host Rhode Island. I think you win that. Then you host Nevada. I think you win that one. Versus Iowa, you get the win there. At Michigan, you take the L. Versus USC, you take the L. At UCLA, you get a win right there. Versus Maryland, you get an L. At Illinois, you take the L. At Rutgers, you get a W. Versus Penn State, you get the L. And then at Wisconsin to close out the year with a win. Not a bad year for Minnesota. Let's move on to the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Dylan Raiola has officially been named the starting quarterback for Nebraska. I think Nebraska fans are a lot excited about this kid. This kid is really good. He can play ball, man. I mean, he is the first true freshman since, I believe, 2018 for Nebraska. He's going to be really solid to watch, and let's go ahead and predict this schedule. Now, for starters, you start at home versus UTEP. I think that's going to be a win right there. Then you take on Colorado at home. I think that is going to be a loss in my book. At Northern Iowa, I think that is a win. Versus Illinois, I think that's a win. At Purdue, that's going to be a win. Versus Rutgers, that is going to be a win. At Indiana, that's a win. At Ohio State, that's a loss. Versus UCLA, that's a win. At USC, you take the loss there. Versus Wisconsin, that's a win. And then at Iowa to close out the year with a loss. That's a pretty good schedule. 3 losses in there for Dylan Raiola in his freshman campaign at Nebraska. And when Matt Rhule is returned as well. Now, moving on is Northwestern. Another team I don't really know much about, but let's go ahead and predict that schedule. Starting with Miami, Ohio, that's going to be a win. Versus Duke, that's going to be a loss. Eastern Illinois at home, that's going to be a win right there. At Washington with the loss versus Indiana with the loss. At Maryland with the win. At Iowa with the loss. At Purdue with the win versus Ohio State with a loss. At Michigan with the loss. And then versus Illinois, I think you take the L in that one. Now, moving on to the prime cream of the crop in the Big Ten Conference, the Ohio State University Buckeyes. What are they going to look like in 2024? Obviously, I got the Chris Olave jersey on, ready to rock Ohio State this year. Well, what are they going to look like in 2024? For starters, you play Akron at home. I think that's a given. That's going to be a win right there. Versus WMU, I don't think that I've heard of that school. That's going to be a win right there. Then you take Marshall on at home. That's going to be a W. At Michigan State with the W. Versus Iowa, that's going to be a win. At Oregon, going to be tough, but it's going to be a win in my book right there. Versus Nebraska, that's going to be tough as well, but you get that one. At Penn State, that's going to be a win. Those 3 games right there, that 3-game stretch or so, is going to be a tough 3-game stretch for Ohio State, especially that Penn State matchup. Now, moving on is versus Purdue. I think you get the win in that one. At Northwestern with the win. Versus Indiana with the win. And then versus Michigan to take the win. And you go undefeated to the Big 12 title game. That's a little hint for you guys. I already have one team in my Big 12 title game. Let's go ahead and talk about the next team, which is a Big 10 newcomer in Oregon. They're going to be pretty good this year. That's just how it's going to go. But for starters, you play Idaho at home. I think you get the win there. Versus Boise State, that's a win. At Oregon State and Ollie Gordon, that's going to be a W right there. Going to be tough, but it's going to be a win. At UCLA with the W. Versus Michigan State with the W. Versus Ohio State, you take that L in that matchup. At Purdue with the win. At versus Illinois with the win. At Michigan with the loss. Versus Maryland with the win. At Michigan, or already did that one. At Washington with a win to close out the year. So, for starters, Oregon being in the Big 12 shouldn't have any problem as well. Moving on, though, is Penn State. What are they going to look like? Drew Allar, I believe, in his last season in 2024. What are they going to look like in this year in college football? Well, at West Virginia, that's a win in my book. Versus Bowling Green, that's going to be a win in my book. Versus Kent State, that's going to be a win. At Illinois, that's a win. Versus UCLA, that's a W. At USC, that is a win, but it's going to be close. At Wisconsin, that's going to be a win right there. Then you come home and you face Ohio State, which I think is going to be a loss right there. Versus Washington, that is going to be a win. At Purdue with the win. Versus Minnesota with the win, and then versus Maryland at home to close out the year with the win. Going to be a fun year for the Penn State Nittany Lions as well. Moving on is the Purdue Boilermakers, a team I think everybody is questionable on this year in the Pac-12. For starters, you host Indiana State. That's going to be a win in my book. Then you take on Notre Dame. That's going to be a loss in my book. At Oregon State, that's going to be a win. Versus Nebraska, that's going to be a loss. At Wisconsin, that's going to be a win. At Illinois with the win. Versus Oregon with the loss. Versus Northwestern with the loss. At Ohio State with a loss. Versus Penn State with a loss. At Michigan State with a loss. And then to close out the year, at Indiana with a W there. Moving on, we have 5 teams left to predict. So let's keep rolling here throughout this video. You guys want to skip and go to my Big Ten Conference title game predictions, you are more than welcome to do so, but we will get there in a second. Starting off with one of the teams, remaining 5 teams, and that is Rutgers. For starters, you get a win versus Howard, versus Akron, and then you go to Virginia Tech and take that L there. At Washington with a loss, at Nebraska with a loss, and versus Wisconsin with a win, versus UCLA with a win, at USC with a loss, versus Minnesota with a loss. At Maryland, versus Illinois, and at Michigan State, all losses to close out the year. I think it's going to be a tough sledding there for Rutgers in the Big Ten, if you ask me. Now, moving on is UCLA. What are they going to look like in their first year in the Big Ten this year? So let's go ahead and predict their schedule. At Hawaii versus Indiana, those two are going to be wins. But at LSU, that's going to be a loss right there. Versus Oregon, that's going to be a loss. At Penn State, that's going to be a loss. Versus Minnesota, that's going to be a win right there. At Rutgers, that is going to be a loss. Versus Iowa, loss. At Washington with a loss. Versus USC with a loss. And then Fresno State with a win there. So that is going to be a tough year for the UCLA Bruins if it ends up going. Hey, who knows? College football is right around the corner. It is a fun thing to predict, but once they start actually playing games, we will know what teams are which way. Now, moving on is probably the biggest newcomer behind Oregon in the Big 12, and that is USC. What are they going to look like in 2024? Well, for starters, they are going to LSU. I think that is going to be a loss right there. Versus Utah State, that is going to be a win. At Michigan, that is going to be a loss. Versus Wisconsin, at Minnesota are both wins. Versus Penn State, that is going to be a loss. At Maryland versus Rutgers are both wins. At Washington, that is a loss. Versus Nebraska, that is a W. At UCLA, that is a W. And then versus Notre Dame, that is a W as well. So, USC has it pretty easy here in the Big 12. Penn State, no Ohio State this year. You do play Michigan. But other than that, that is their schedule for the Big Ten. So not tough sledding at all if you're asking me. Moving on is another newcomer in the national championship game, Washington. What are they going to look like in 2024? Well, for starters, you play host to Weber State. That's going to be a win versus Eastern Michigan. And then versus Washington State are all wins as well. Then you take on Northwestern at home. That's going to be a win. At Rutgers is a win. Versus Michigan, that's a loss. At Iowa, that's a loss. At Indiana, that is a win. Versus USC, that is a win. At Penn State, that is a loss. Versus UCLA, that is a win. And then at Oregon, that is a loss as well. And then our last team in the Big 12, sort of kind of going quickly here, Wisconsin. What are they going to be in this new year with 2024 on the horizon? Now, for starters, you play WMU at home. That is a win. Versus South Dakota at home. Then you go to Alabama. That is going to be a loss right there. At USC, that is a loss. Versus Purdue, that is a loss as well. At Rutgers, that is a loss. At Northwestern, that's a win. Versus Penn State, that is a win. Or that is a loss, excuse me. At Iowa versus Oregon. At Nebraska. And then versus Minnesota. All losses to close out the year. Tough sledding in the Big Ten for Wisconsin fans, I know, but you guys will one day get there. Now, moving on to the Big Ten title game. What is the Big Ten title game going to be consistent of? It is the Ohio State Buckeyes versus the Oregon Ducks in a rematch of a regular season game, and I think Ohio State will win the Big Ten in 2024. Anyway, that is where I'm going to leave it for today's video. Once again, if you have not already, like, subscribe, turn that bell on. We do our best to post on this channel every single day. That is all. I'm going to hop off, get this first video edited so you all can watch it on time. STC predictions are up next, so stay tuned for that one as well. We will be doing that as well this week too. So with that being said, I'm going to hop off, again, get this edited. Thank you all so much for watching, as I will see you all in the next video. Peace.